We're carrying on with our topic of philosophy of time. We're moving, however, away from McTaggart's argument and the A and B theory of time, which were responses to McTaggart's argument, to another topic, which is the debate between presentism and eternalism. So this is a debate concerning what exists in time. So the presentist is someone who claims that only present objects exist. So only those objects, events, and times that are temporally present exist. So all of reality, if you like, is just three-dimensional rather than four-dimensional. So it comprises just of what others might think of as one slice of time. So the whole of physical space, but just taken for one single moment of time. But the idea will be that, of course, just as the present changes, so too what exists changes. So the presentist is going to think, for instance, that you're listening to this lecture right now is something that exists. But things like the Big Bang, William Shakespeare, the American Civil War, so these past things, events, objects, and so on, don't exist. And likewise, they'll think that future events and moments and objects don't exist, like the year 2030, Queen Elizabeth II's great-great-grandchildren, the inauguration of the 50th President of the United States, and so on. So those are some of the things that the presentist denies to exist. Distinguished from this, perhaps the sort of opposite end of the spectrum is the so-called eternalist view. So the eternalist says that past and future objects, events, and times exist, as well as present objects, events, and times. So the basically reality can be considered to be a four-dimensional entity, so extended not just in space but also in time. So it consists not only of a present moment but also past and future moments and whatever happens during those past and future moments, and those are real just as the present is. So all of those things that we said before that the presentist denies to exist exist according to the eternalist. So the Big Bang, the American Civil War, and so on. So as I said, the eternalist thinks of reality as a four-dimensional structure, so it's extended in time, not just in space. Sometimes this is known as the block universe view. So the idea is that reality or existence is this four-dimensional block or four-dimensional entity. Now, these aren't the only two views. So that, as I said, they're kind of opposite ends of the spectrum. So that the presentist saying that only the present exists, eternalist saying past, present, and future all exist. There's a third view that is at least somewhat popular, which is known as the growing universe theory and is sort of a halfway house between presentism and eternalism. So the growing universe theory, sometimes called the growing block theory, is the thesis that the past and present exist, but the future doesn't. So past and present exist, future doesn't. And likewise, of course, past and present objects and events exist, but future objects and events don't exist. So those past things like the Big Bang and William Shakespeare and I guess the year 1200 exist. On the other hand, things like the year 2030, Queen Elizabeth's great-great-grandchildren, and so on, future things don't exist. So sometimes, as I said, it's called the growing block theory. So again, sort of similar to eternalism, it thinks of reality as a four-dimensional space-time structure, except that whilst eternalism thinks of reality as extending not just in the past direction but in the future direction, the growing universe theorist thinks of it as existing, as extending just in the past direction, but that it's constantly growing. So it's increasing in size as the present, if you like, marches onwards. So as more and more things become present and then past, so this four-dimensional structure extends, becomes larger. Objects and events go to being past, go to being present and past, and so come into existence in that way. So this is, as I say, an alternative to presentism and eternalism that's endorsed by at least some philosophers. You might sort of wonder, I mean, we're going to be speaking more broadly about the motivations and advantages and disadvantages of these various views shortly. You might sort of wonder why some people in particular might go for the growing universe theory. And basically the answer is that those who defend it have thought that it does a good job of explaining a sense in which the past is settled or fixed whilst the future is open. So I think, ordinarily we think about time as having an asymmetry of fixedness or settledness. So it is very common, I think, for us human beings to consider the past to be gone and nothing can be done about it. It's fixed, it's settled, it's immutable, we can't change it. Whereas we think, by contrast, the future is something that is open, is not yet settled or fixed, that we can change. And so the one arguable advantage of the growing universe theory is that it gives a sense to this. It's a metaphysical view that, if you like, makes sense of this ordinary way of thinking about time, because it does provide a sense in which the past is fixed and the future is not. Namely, the past exists whilst the future does not. So this, for instance, helps explain why we have philosophers who endorse a growing universe theory, but we don't, conversely, as to the best of my knowledge, have any philosophers who endorse the converse shrinking universe theory. So that would, I suppose, be a logically possible view, namely that the present and future exist, but the past does not, and that the reality, if you like, is becoming smaller as more and more stuff moves into the non-existent past, if you'll forgive the metaphor. But I mean, it seems like a logically possible view that one could have, but not many people endorse it. If anyone endorses it, to the best of my knowledge, no one does. And I think that's because it, if you like, seems to get things the wrong way round, right? So it seems to provide a sense in which the future's settled or fixed, but the past isn't, and that seems to be quite the opposite of what we ordinarily think. Okay, so these three views will say a bit about what maybe some of the advantages and disadvantages associated with the views. Now, I think that perhaps the key argument that's been given for presentism is, I suppose, conversely, an argument against eternalism and also the growing universe theory. So it's a kind of argument that says, well, presentism is the more intuitive or common sense view, and maybe we should prefer a metaphysical theory that's more common sense rather than a more outlandish one. So the presentist will often accuse the eternalist or growing universe theorist of adopting a somewhat outlandish metaphysics. So the presentists might, for instance, point out that it seems very odd to say that dinosaurs exist, or there are some dinosaurs, so similarly existentially quantifying over dinosaurs. So both the eternalist and the growing universe theorist are presumably committed to this. They're committed to the existence of the past, and given that the past, it seems, contains dinosaurs, they also seem to be committed to the existence of dinosaurs. The Eternalist is also committed, as we've mentioned earlier, to the existence of future objects and events. So it would seem that the Eternalist is committed to, for instance, the existence of Queen Elizabeth II's great-great-grandchildren. Now, the growing universe theorist obviously isn't committed to that, but they're still committed to the existence of dinosaurs. Now, the presentist is going to say, well, this just seems remarkably odd to say that dinosaurs exist or that Queen Elizabeth's great-great-grandchildren exist. We might rather be inclined to say something like, well, dinosaurs used to exist, but they don't exist now. Or that Queen Elizabeth's great-great-grandchildren may perhaps exist, but currently don't exist. So this is a sort of appeal to ordinary language and ordinary ways of thinking about the world. And insofar as we think that our metaphysical theories ought to be grounded in common sense or common ways of thinking and speaking, then this would arguably be a virtue of presentism and a disadvantage of the rivals. Now, the Eternalist and also, I suppose, the growing universe theorist has a response to this quite common argument in favour of presentism. So what they say is that the oddity of saying things like dinosaurs exist is not to be explained by the fact that it's false, but it's to be explained by just the pragmatics of the way in which our language works. So let me give you an analogy that might help make things a bit clearer. So suppose that I'm driving in a busy car park, like on the slide, and I'm looking for a parking space. I can't see one anywhere. And suppose my passenger turns to me and says, there is a parking space. Then, maybe I get excited and I look extra hard, turning right and left to try and find this parking space that my passenger is referring to. And my passenger says, oh, no, I didn't mean there was a parking space in this parking lot. Rather, I meant there is a parking space somewhere in the universe. Now, it seems that it would be reasonable for me to be a little bit annoyed by the behaviour of my passenger at this stage, because it was very natural of me to interpret them as saying that there's a space in this car park, rather than simply meaning there's a space somewhere in the universe. So this is an instance of what logicians might call quantifier restriction. So what I had understood was that my passenger was talking about things in this car park, and when they said there is a space, I took them to be quantifying over, in the logician's terminology, the domain of things in this car park. And so I took them, in other words, to be saying that there is a space, a parking space in this car park. Whereas actually my passenger somewhat deviously was not intending that restriction, that domain restriction, but was quantifying over a more universal domain, the domain maybe of things in the entire universe. And relative to that domain, of course, it's true, presumably, that there is a parking space somewhere or other. But what this goes to show is that in ordinary conversation, it's often the case that when we quantify, we intend our quantifiers to be understood as domain restricted. So it's very natural to understand the assertion there is a parking space uttered in a car when we're driving around the car park to be restricted to the set of objects in the car park. Right, okay, so that's the analogy. Now let me try to explain how it applies. What the Eternalist is going to say to the Presentist is the following. So the Presentist, remember, has said it sounds awfully funny to say there are dinosaurs, or dinosaurs exist, or Queen Elizabeth's great-great-grandchildren exist. Now, the Eternalist is going to say, well, yeah, okay, it does sound funny, but that's, again, something to do with how quantifier restriction works in ordinary language. So when I say, or when you say to me, there are dinosaurs, it's very natural for me to take your quantificational claim, there exist, to be restricted to a specific domain that's smaller than the universe as a whole. So specifically, it's natural for me to interpret you as saying there are dinosaurs in the present moment. So presently there are dinosaurs, or dinosaurs exist within the present, or something like that. Just as when my passenger said there's a parking space, it was natural for me to think that they were saying there's a parking space in this car park. So likewise, when you say there are dinosaurs or dinosaurs exist, it's natural for me to interpret you as saying there are dinosaurs in the present moment. But that, of course, is false, right? There are no dinosaurs in the present moment, presumably. However, the Eternalist will say, if we lift that restriction on our domain of quantification, then we speak truly when we say there are dinosaurs. So if we understand when someone says there are dinosaurs, merely that they mean there are dinosaurs somewhere in the universe, in all of space and time, then the Eternalist is going to say that they speak truly. Just as when my passenger says there is a parking space, if I understand them as meaning there's a parking space somewhere in space and time, then of course they speak truly too. So what they're going to say is that in the most unrestricted domain of discourse, the entire universe, or relative to that, the claim that dinosaurs exist is true, just as the claim that there exists a parking space is true. It's just that it sounds odd because normally when we use language, we're typically not talking about totally unrestricted domains of discourse. So that's the way that the Eternalist responds to this key challenge, namely that it sounds very odd to say things like dinosaurs exist. And of course, the growing universe theorists can help themselves to the same response. So that's a kind of a defensive strategy that is commonly taken against the presentist in this respect. So I think, this is pretty much what I've just said. So past and future objects, there are, according to the Eternalist, past and future objects in the most unrestricted domain of quantification, but we often quantify over more restricted domains, and I think, often when you quantify, then it's quite common for the other participants in the conversation to understand that quantification restrictedly, even if you haven't explicitly pointed out that it's restricted. So, for instance, when my passenger says that there's a space, it was natural for me to assume that they meant in this car park rather than in the universe. Okay. So the Eternalist and also maybe the growing universe theorist might also slightly go on the offensive against the presentist here and point out that actually sometimes we really do seem to be quantifying over past and perhaps future times and the objects within them. So, for instance, it seems quite a natural claim to say there's a first moment in time, right? It might be true, it might be false. But certainly if it's true, then, it seems that we're referring to a particular moment of time. And it would be actually quite odd to think that we were referring to the present moment. For the presentist, it's sort of hard to see how, if we say there's a first moment in time, Given that only the present moment exists, it would seem that that has to refer to the present moment, which would seem somewhat odd in itself. So I think normally if someone says there's a first moment in time, they take themselves to be quantifying, referring to some non-present moment, which seems to be favourable to the Eternalist. Or, even if we didn't believe that there was a first moment in time, that the rival hypothesis might be expressed by saying something like, for every event or every moment, there's some earlier event or earlier moment. So that would sort of convey the idea that time is extended infinitely in the past direction, or likewise we could say that with respect to the future. For every moment or event, there's a later moment or event. Again, these seem like quite natural things to say, at least when we're talking, in maybe a physics class or a metaphysics class. And these appear to be quantifying over non-actual, non-present moments or events. So these perfectly natural ways of speaking actually do seem to commit us to the existence of something the presentist denies the existence of, namely past and future moments and events. So yeah, I mean, maybe there's ways of actually supporting eternalism, or maybe the growing universe theory, by appealing to ordinary language, and it's not just straightforwardly favourable to the presentist. Okay, so we considered a key objection, apparent objection to the growing universe theory and to eternalism, namely that saying, for instance, dinosaurs exist seems odd. We considered a response to it. There are other sorts of objections that might be levelled against the various theories. So there's a specific objection that might be levelled against the growing universe theory, and indeed has been levelled against growing universe theory, which is the objection that if the universe is growing, then it seems that there must be some rate at which it's growing, right? So I think normally when we speak of some process, like in this case growth, right? Of course, you could talk about growth of a plant or a person or something like that. Growth even of the planet or something like that potentially, or a mountain range. And when we talk about processes like this, it always seems to make sense to talk about, well, what's the rate of growth? So you might say something like with the Himalayas, I don't know, it might be 1 centimeter per year or something like that. That might be wildly inaccurate. I have no idea. But we can describe a rate, or it might be that a plant grows at half a meter a year or something like that. Now, the growing universe theorist says that the universe itself is growing, or space-time itself, I suppose, is growing. And so it would seem that it must make sense, therefore, to talk about the rate at which the universe is growing, just as it makes sense in the case of every other process to talk about its rate. However, I suppose the critic of the growing universe theory is likely to say that, well, there seems to be no really sensible answer to the question of what rate does the universe grow at. So what are we supposed to say? Are we supposed to say it grows at an hour per hour or a minute per minute? That might seem a kind of vacuous statement. It's not. It certainly doesn't seem to have the sort of substance of saying that, for instance, a plant grows at half a meter a year. Saying that the universe or space-time grows at an hour per hour doesn't. It's hard to make sense of that in any meaningful way. or I suppose you might say something like a trillion objects per hour, but which might work, but it sort of seems like a sort of slightly puzzling metric, or maybe slightly more puzzling than when we talk about the growth of the Himalayas or a plant. So it's so I think a lot of philosophers are worried about whether there's some sensible answer to this question, and have thought that, well, if there's no sensible answer to the question about what rate at which the universe is growing, then actually we should not take the universe to be growing, because they will say if some process like growth is occurring, then it always makes sense to talk about the rate at which that occurs. Now, so I mean, there are sorts of potential ways that the growing universe theorists might respond. So if somehow they could appeal to a second stream of time, then I suppose they could sensibly talk about the rate at which the universe grows in terms of a sort of external reference point, an external stream of time. So it might be, I suppose that the idea would be that you can measure, for instance, the speed of one clock by using another clock, and then it would make perfect sense to say things like, if the clocks are in sync, then presumably a minute on one clock passes per minute passing on the other clock, and then that seems actually, it seems that we're actually saying something sensible. Or alternatively, it could be that the first clock is running slow, so a minute on the first clock takes 2 minutes on the second clock to elapse, or it could be running fast, in which case a minute on the first clock might take 30 seconds on the second clock to pass, and then we seem to have some sort of contentful answer. But it's just not clear what, if we were talking about the sort of universe as a whole and trying to measure its rate of growth, what the external frame of reference would be, right? So if the universe just, is everything, then it seems that there can't be any external frame of reference to measure the growth of the universe with respect to. So perhaps that's another way of putting the problem. Okay, so there are certainly some issues or some challenges for the growing universe theory. Now, we've so far considered a challenge to the growing universe theory. We've considered a challenge that seems to apply both to eternalism and the growing universe theory, although we have looked at a response to it. What about presentism? So presentism obviously presents itself as, quite an intuitive view. Are there any disadvantages to it? Well, yes, and there's some quite widely discussed problems for presentism, and these, I suppose, the presentist in turn has some responses, and there's a lot of philosophical discussion goes on about whether presentism can overcome these problems. One problem, or one apparent problem, is a problem of causation. So, for instance, take a perfectly ordinary thing to say, such as Joe Biden's election victory caused him to be US president. So I think, that seems fairly uncontroversial. Maybe Trump thinks it's controversial that he won the victory. But anyway, something to do with the election presumably caused Biden to be president. However, the problem for the presentist is that because Biden's election victory was in the past, it doesn't exist. But you might think, well, how can an event that doesn't exist cause one that does, right? So his being US president is a present state of the world. So for the presentist, presumably Joe Biden's property of being the US president exists, or his state of being the US president exists. But the thing that we'd ordinarily say was the cause of this present state, namely his election victory, according to the presentist, doesn't exist because it's in the past. And you get this problem quite generally for the presentist with causation, because normally we think, well, causes occur earlier than their effects. But the difficulty for the presentist, of course, is, well, only one moment exists. So at most, one of the cause and the effect can exist, right? So present effects seem to lack past causes because the past doesn't exist, and I suppose likewise present causes seem to lack future effects because the future doesn't exist. And isn't this just very bizarre, and doesn't it suggest that, our ordinary ways of explaining things, which are often causal explanations, are flawed if presentism is true? So you might think that in fact it's so absurd to have to reject all of these causal explanations that it would be better to reject presentism and go perhaps for eternalism instead. We'll come back to what the presentists could potentially say in response in a moment, but first I'm going to introduce what seems to be another problem for the presentist, or what people have claimed is another problem for the presentist. Now, this is a problem kind of related, but to the problem of causation, but somewhat different. This is a problem of reference. So the problem here is that it seems that I can refer to non-present entities. This is particularly obvious, I think, with past entities like William Shakespeare. So I can say things like William Shakespeare was a playwright, or William Shakespeare wrote Macbeth. And, I seem to be talking about this person, William Shakespeare. And my sentence is going to be true if indeed this person was a playwright, if indeed he wrote Macbeth, and so on. But the problem for the presentist is, well, how can I refer to something that doesn't exist, right? So for the presentist, Shakespeare's a past object, so doesn't exist. So how can I possibly refer to him? And you might think, well, so as a way of maybe making this sort of challenge more acute, you might think, well, there are sentences like Shakespeare was a playwright on the one hand, and then sentences like Santa Claus delivers presents on the other hand, and maybe sentences like Shakespeare wasn't a playwright on the other hand, on the third hand, if you have three hands. And we ordinarily think that there's a distinction between these sorts of sentences, right? So we think William Shakespeare was a playwright is true. We think William Shakespeare wasn't a playwright is false. We maybe think that Santa Claus delivers presents is maybe a trickier case. We might think that it's kind of not literally true, but kind of true in an elliptical way. So a standard way of thinking about that is that, well, Santa Claus is a fiction, and it's true according to the fiction that Santa Claus delivers presents, even though it's not straightforwardly true that Santa Claus delivers presents because there is no Santa Claus. Sorry, everyone. Ruin that for some people, maybe. But you might think, well, okay, so maybe when it comes to Shakespeare is a playwright, we could give that a treatment like Santa Claus delivers presents. We could maybe say, well, there's this sort of fictional past or something, and it's true according to the fiction of the past that Shakespeare was a playwright. But that doesn't really do justice, I think, to what we ordinarily think we're talking about. So I think if I say Santa Claus delivers presents, then I'm sort of aware that I'm engaging in this sort of fictionalization. Whereas if I say Shakespeare wrote Hamlet, or Shakespeare wrote Macbeth, or whatever the example I gave earlier was, then I don't think I'm fictionalizing. I think I'm speaking kind of literal truth, and referring to this guy who Shakespeare, who did indeed write Macbeth. And the challenge is, well, first of all, how can I refer to him if he doesn't exist? And secondly, what is it that relatedly, what is it that makes it true that he wrote Macbeth rather than didn't write Macbeth, if he doesn't exist? So the presentist, most presentists won't simply kind of bite the bullet and accept that Shakespeare wrote Macbeth is lacking truth or falsity. They also are pretty unlikely to say that it's a kind of fictional truth in the same way that Santa Claus delivers Christmas presents is a kind of fictional truth, or a truth of a fiction. They much more commonly will say that sentences like Shakespeare wrote Macbeth can be true, even though literally true, not sort of fictionally true, despite the non-existence of Shakespeare. Likewise, when it comes to causation, they'll normally say things like Biden's election victory caused him to be president. Caused him to be president. They'll normally say that can be literally true, even though his election victory doesn't exist. So how do they do that? Well, it seems that they've got to supply some sort of truth conditions, right? They've got to explain what makes those sentences true. In particular, why do we regard Shakespeare wrote Macbeth as true, whilst we regard Shakespeare didn't write Macbeth as false, right? So there's got to be something that distinguishes those two if we're to assign them different truth values. Now, the Eternalist and also the growing universe theorists can simply appeal to an ordinary sort of truth maker. So they can say, look, there exists a guy, William Shakespeare. He has the property of having written Macbeth, or he's appropriately related causally to the manuscript of Macbeth. And that's what makes it true that Shakespeare wrote Macbeth. Of course, as I've said, the presentists can't appeal to that, so they're going to have to appeal to something else. What have they got? What resources do they have? Well, according to them, only the present exists, so it seems that it's got to be something about the present that makes it true that Shakespeare wrote Macbeth. So, in other words, in sort of putting it in kind of jargon, the truth maker for the sentence Shakespeare wrote Macbeth has got to be something that exists in the present. So you might think, well, what could that be? One thought might be, well, there are records or something like that, right? So then maybe there are records that Shakespeare wrote Macbeth. Maybe it's a matter of the fact that the name William Shakespeare is printed on the front cover of copies of the text of Macbeth or something like that. Or generally historical records and so on. So you might think, well, maybe it's the existence of these records that makes true the sentence that Shakespeare wrote Macbeth, according to the Presentist. But I suppose, so maybe that will work, but you might wonder whether there are equivalent records for every past tense sentence that we want to take to be true or false, or to have truth value. So, for instance, consider a claim like Shakespeare had porridge for breakfast on his 30th birthday. Now, I think ordinarily we'd think that that's either going to be true or false. We don't know whether I have no idea whether it is true or false. But presumably there's a fact of the matter, right? Either he did or he didn't. But it's quite likely that there's no historical record existing in the present of what Shakespeare had for breakfast on his 30th birthday. And so it seems unclear what the Presentist is going to say is the truth maker for that claim. So certainly this presents a challenge. There's another sort of worry for the Presentist, and actually this also applies to some extent to the growing universe theorist. And I'm going to try and avoid getting too technical on this, but this is an objection from contemporary physics. So one of the leading contemporary physical theories is the theory of special relativity. So originally due to Einstein. Now, this, again, without getting too technical, it seems that according to special relativity, there's no such thing as absolute simultaneity. Simultaneity is relative to a reference frame, and a reference frame is determined by a velocity. So what does that mean? What it means is that depending upon the speed and direction that you're travelling in other words, the velocity you're travelling at, you will observe or experience different things as present. So, for instance, if we are travelling in a rocket ship, but travelling in different directions, and we pass each other, maybe going in the opposite direction, and so going at different velocities, or maybe we're going at different speeds, so we're going at different velocities. Then, according to contemporary physics, what will count as simultaneous with the moment at which we pass each other in our rocket ships will be different for you and for me. So that's quite counterintuitive, right? So ordinarily we're used to agreeing on what with other people about which events are simultaneous. According to contemporary physics, that's really an artifact of the fact that most of us, almost all of us, are travelling at very similar velocities, right? So we're both we're all walking about, or sitting around, or even driving on the surface of the planet Earth, and we might be going moving around on the surface of the Earth, but critically, our velocities are all very small compared to the speed of light. What special relativity implies is that were we all travelling around at very large fractions of the speed of light, maybe in different directions, then disagreement about what's simultaneous with what would become apparent. Now, okay, so yeah, there's a sort of kind of explanation of the implications of special relativity for the notion of simultaneity without going into too much technical detail. Why would this pose a problem for the presentist? Well, the notion of the present is presumably some set of space-time points or some set of events that are all simultaneous with one another, right? So whatever the present is, presumably it's supposed to be a set of simultaneous points or events. It would seem odd to say that, we considered this last week, it would seem odd to say that some of the present is in the future of other parts of the present. So if you remember this objection that St. Augustine had, that it just simply seems a contradiction in terms to suppose that some parts of the present are in the future or the past of other parts of the present. So presumably it follows that all parts of the present have to be simultaneous with one another. Now, of course, the presentist, for the presentist, the notion of the present is particularly significant because the present is all that exists, right? So the present is going to be some set of events or points that are simultaneous with one another and that all exist. But now we've seen that from the point of view of contemporary physics, what is present is relative to a reference frame. What is simultaneous is relative to a reference frame, and therefore, since the present moment, present events have to be simultaneous with one another, it seems to follow that what's present is going to depend upon one's reference frame, or in other words, one's velocity. So, if we're traveling in our different rocket ships, then I'm going to experience as present a different collection of events than the ones that you experience as present. But you might think, well, this is sort of problematic because it kind of seems implausible that what exists is somehow relative to a frame of reference or relative to a velocity, as though somehow if we're traveling at different velocities, then my reality is different from your reality, where, you know, we literally have separate realities from one another. That might seem like a confused way of speaking. Now, the Eternalist obviously doesn't confront this problem because they allow that past and future as well as present exist. So what's present doesn't determine what exists for them, so they sidestep that. But for the presentist, it seems like a problem that has to be confronted. So what are we to say? Just that reality is different depending on one's velocity. That seems a strange thing. They might alternatively say, well, yeah, maybe we perceive different things as present, but maybe there's a sort of true present, right, that's not velocity dependent, or maybe that corresponds to a special privileged reference frame. But then the problem is, I think, to say which is the privileged reference frame, so which is the true present. How are we to motivate the idea that there's a true present when physics doesn't seemingly present us with one? And secondly, I think there's also a question of the motivation for the presentist. So part of the motivation for presentism was that it was sort of intuitive, and part of the reason it was intuitive was perhaps because we sort of, similar to the A theory motivation, we kind of experience the present as being special, right? It seems special to us. It seems particularly vivid to us. And not only does it seem particularly vivid to us, it seems particularly vivid to the people around us, and we can all broadly agree on what's present. So that seemed to motivate giving it sort of special ontological status. But now we've seen that this intersubjective agreement in particular, it may be just an artifact of the fact that we're traveling at similar velocities. When we find out that, in fact, the experience of present is velocity relative, then, you know, it turns out that maybe this intersubjective agreement wouldn't persist if we were traveling at high speeds. And then you might think, well, you know, should we really, given its sort of artificial nature, should we really think of this as as corresponding to something ontologically significant or not. And, of course, as I said, one might try to pick out a special reference frame that defines the present, right? But I think, the worry is that you then give up the connection between what's truly present and what people experience as present. And if it was that this sort of experience of the present as special that was supposed to motivate presentism, then we seem to undermine that key motive for presentism. So some of these considerations are rather like considerations relevant to the A theory, and you'll probably notice quite an analogy between some of the pros and cons of presentism and some of the pros and cons of the A theory, because both presentism and the A theory provide some sort of sense in which the present is metaphysically privileged, right? So presentism metaphysically privileges it by saying that it exists and nothing else exists. The A theory, presentism might be considered a version of the A theory, but generally the A theory says that there's something metaphysically special about the present, even if that might not be that it's the only moment that exists, as the presentist says. But these sorts of considerations that suggest that maybe our experiential present can't really correspond to any sort of invariant objective present, provide reasons for sort of doubting one of the original motivations for these theories. Okay, so that's it for this week. Hopefully in seminars we'll have a little bit of time to discuss the relationship between the Presentism Eternalism debate on the one hand and the A theory B theory debate on the other hand. As I say, they're not the same debates, although you can obviously should be able to see some kind of analogy between presentism and the A theory, for instance. Okay, so, and then next week we will, I suppose, join two of our topics together, namely the sort of topics that we've considered over the course of term, namely causation and time. So we're going to specifically be looking at the direction of time and the direction of causation. And specifically, we're going to think about this in the context of the possibility of time travel, which is quite a fun topic to finish up the term with. So I will see some of you in seminars and speak to you all again next week. Hope you have a good week. Bye.